So to start things formally, before we start the presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand, the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and contribution they make to the life of this region. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands of our online participants today, whether listening live or in a recording later on. And I welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be participating in today's webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So the title of today's webinar is Supporting Use of the Parent and Family Engagement Implementation Guide. By way of introduction, this webinar comes at a time when a pandemic has brought the nation to a virtual lockdown. Life is not normal, work is not normal, schooling is definitely not normal, and I thank you for participating today during this period of stress and change. While webinars are increasingly normal for some of us, many would-be participants will not have the resources to take part today, so we'll be making a recording of this webinar freely available with them in mind and ask you to share it widely, as will we. We're here to discuss a very rich and informative document, a guide that aims to help educators and school leaders implement a powerful change in their school communities for better student outcomes. By now, you'll all know the why, the value of parents and family engagement in the education system. This guide offers advice on the how good practice in engaging parents and families in school communities can be achieved. The advice in this guide was released just a few short weeks ago, and our school communities are strikingly different today. While schooling and education will change and evolve to meet circumstances, we hope, through your efforts, for the relationship between educators and families to endure. The research and work that's gone into this guide has been the passion of ARACE's Barbara Barker, research manager and lead of the Federal Department of Education's funded Parent Engagement Project since 2014. Barbara is a social research specialist with over 20 years' experience across the non-profit, private and government sectors. Prior to joining ARACE, Barbara was a consultant to federal government clients, making significant contributions to program evaluation, social marketing and service delivery development across a diverse range of social research and policy areas. I now happily hand over to Barb, and if you could just bear with us while we make the switch, we're all working remotely. Barbara will be delivering her presentation shortly.
Thanks, Dale. Welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me, and I hope that that's a clear screen for you. I'm really excited to be able to present this to you today. And I'm particularly looking at the numbers growing of people who are attending the presentation and those that have signed up to register as well. It's a really encouraging thing to see. So thanks a lot for joining me. And before I start, I'd like to also thank my colleague Dale for his acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to echo his words. I'm also based here in Canberra, though of course we're working from our respective places. So I'm at my house, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand. And I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening to this presentation. As Dale mentioned, we recently published our resource for school communities to help strengthen family engagement practices, and I'm going to touch on some of that today. Also, as Dale mentioned, I'd like to start by also acknowledging the Australian government and in particular the Department of Education and our team of colleagues there who've worked closely with us really for the last 5 years as we've worked together on the Parent Engagement Project that they generously funded. An extensive body of research was developed during the course of that project, and all of that is now publicly available on our website, as will the recording from this webinar be also. We've got a lot to cover in the next little while, so let's get started. By way of an outline, you should be able to see on the screen now. Here's what I'd like to discuss in the next 40 minutes or so, and we'll see how we go with that timing. If we run a little bit over, we might not be able to take as many questions as I'd like to, but I'll try to finish with enough time to answer at least a few questions that you might have. So we'll see how we go with that. Look, given I'm speaking to probably quite a converted audience, I'll only briefly discuss why we think parent and family engagement in learning is really important for schools and their communities. I'm then planning to take you through some key aspects of our implementation guide. And obviously I can't talk about all of it in this one session today. It is about 120 odd pages. It's quite long with a lot of really rich information for you. But today I'd like to talk about some key steps to embedding engagement so that it becomes a cultural aspect of the school, much less about what we sometimes hear kind of optional extras, or it's a nice to have, that there's some sort of never really quite time for. So how you might start to go about embedding that engagement. I'd like to touch on what it means for staff and how capacity building is really important, particularly given what we know about the need for professional development in this area. And finally, the sustainability of efforts and how you might approach that. I'll also finish by touching on our three-staged approach, remembering that all of this is very flexible and will be largely driven by the individual context and setting of each school, community, or indeed cluster of schools. This webinar obviously comes, as Dale also mentioned, at a time when everything to do with education and learning has been turned on its head, and these are strange times indeed. We're all grappling with how to be the parents or carers we want to be in these times, and if we're educators and school leaders, how we want to respond to best support our students and their families. I think it's worth touching on the fact that at Eracy we use our nest to think about the different aspects of children's well-being, and this can be especially useful in stressful times like these to make sure that they have what they need. As many of you will know, the nest is an evidence-based well-being framework for young people, which says that for an Australian child to truly have high well-being, they must be doing well in 6 interlocking dimensions. They are, of course, being loved and safe, healthy, learning, having material basics, participating, and having a positive sense of identity and culture. The research tells us that children and young people need to be doing well in each area to truly thrive. So while some of the dimensions like healthy, learning, and material basics may be in front of mind right now, there are other things we need to be thinking about as we seek to ensure that we're able to holistically look at and support our kids' well-being. And I think that's just something to keep in mind as we work through this session. Well, over the last 5 years, really since 2014, but before that as well, probably actually since 2012, Eracy's been working in the space of parent engagement. But since 2014, we've been working on this significant project with the Australian government. It's called the Parent Engagement Project. We kind of loosely termed it the PE project. And throughout the project, Eracy worked with a range of stakeholders, researchers, schools, educators, agencies, practitioners, a whole raft of different people to learn and to gather and to understand what makes the difference when it comes to implementing successful parent and family engagement practices in communities, in school communities. And importantly, I think it's worth noting here that by parent, we mean adults looking after that child. Not necessarily birth parents, it can obviously be foster parents, it can be an extended family, it can be community. In a lot of Aboriginal communities, it can be the elders who are creating an environment that encourages and enhances the learning and well-being of children. But we were also hearing feedback that some were still feeling excluded by the term parent. So we now refer to this as parent and family engagement, or just family engagement in learning. And sometimes you might see throughout the slides, I'm not sure, you might see the acronym or the abbreviation PFE, which stands for Parent and Family Engagement. So why does it matter, and why do we need to talk about it? Well, I think it's important before I start that I acknowledge, as Dale also mentioned in the beginning in his introduction, that I'm not an educator myself. I am a researcher, so I come to this with a research lens, and we've spent a lot of time throughout this project sifting through all the wonderful information that's out there, as well as generating our own research. But we understand that research from the past 50 years has established that families matter. We know they do. We know that they play powerful roles in both what and how children learn, which makes their engagement in learning a very strong predictor of a young person's development, their educational attainment and their success in school and life. We also know that learning doesn't just happen at school. It happens anywhere and any time. And we're really seeing that come to the fore now. Kids aren't at school, they're at home. They're really just at home, aren't they? And in their gardens and in the park if they're lucky. And so families are supporting, encouraging that learning continually. And we know that families also matter because of this very fact. Learning never stops. And the ability for families to provide that support from the early years right through to secondary school and beyond is invaluable. And clearly it looks different as a child develops and progresses through school. Some of you might be representing the early years sector today. Others might be representing high schools and secondary schools and all of that in between as well. So clearly it looks different as a child develops and progresses, but the family's engagement in that child's learning remains really important throughout. There are actually relatively low levels of awareness about the impact of parents on a child's learning and development. Families all come with their own experience of learning, their experience of being at school. So there can be a lot of misunderstanding, emotional baggage, fear, that sort of thing. Plus, we understand that families often don't realise they're actually doing parent engagement, quote unquote, really well. It's not always recognised, and therefore it's not necessarily reinforced or celebrated. Combine that with the fact that teachers aren't often trained in forming relationships with their families for the benefit of student outcomes. We know it's not a key focus in teacher college, and it may happen, well, it needs to happen, but it only may happen through mentoring or on-the-job training, although that's not guaranteed. And our research with families and educators and even school leaders has consistently shown a mixed bag of assumptions and beliefs about what family engagement is and what it means. So there's still quite a long way, we found, to go to embed that understanding. Capacity building is really needed. I'll touch on this a bit more further on, but we know that despite its positive impacts on learning and wellbeing outcomes for students, and that there are the AITSL standards for teachers in family engagement. Those of you who are educators out there will know about your 3.7 and your 7.3 standards. We know that despite that, training and development in this area is a little bit mixed. This can be a significant issue in school communities where there might be a cultural disconnect between families and teachers. Some educators, for instance, aren't equipped with the skills and confidence to understand the different perspectives on learning that different sorts of families might have. And this can prevent families from feeling included in their school community. And it might also reduce their engagement in their child's learning. To improve the confidence and skills of teachers in things like cultural awareness, we know that building their capacity is key to shifting mindsets, to developing resources for families, and improving their confidence in drawing on parents' interests and capacities for student outcomes. So what is family engagement in learning? I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I think it's worth addressing several key points here before we go any further. A fundamental aspect of family engagement, and one that many understandably grapple with, is that by its very nature, we're often talking about something that isn't always seen by schools and educators. Families supporting and encouraging their child or young person is something that tends to happen, obviously, away from or outside of school. So what I like to call the magic stuff, the stuff that happens in homes, in cars, when we're driving somewhere with our family, in communities, anywhere that families spend time together in everyday activities. So we hear labels like parent or family involvement used interchangeably with engagement. And I mean, this is a relatively minor point, but I think it's worth discussing further. They're not just labels. We actually see involvement and engagement as different things. And parents or families' engagement with their children's learning may not actually equate to, and it should definitely not be judged on the basis of their involvement with the school. So many parents, particularly those from ethnic minorities or those facing economic challenge, as you well may know, will find or may find engagement with schools difficult. But they still might have a really strong desire to be engaged in their child's learning and education. So one way of thinking about this is as a continuum, moving from parent involvement with a school to engagement with a child's learning. This is some thinking and some work, this continuum that's being developed by Dr. Janet Goodall, who is working out of the UK. Actually, she's based in Wales at the moment. And she's worked a lot with parent engagement with communities facing disadvantage and vulnerable families. And she talks a lot about this idea of the continuum, if you like. So what we're trying to do is take away the emphasis from the relationship between parents and schools to a focus on the relationship between parents or families and their child and their child's learning. And I think it's important here to note that schools might find themselves at different points on this continuum at different points of time, or with different activities, or even with different cohorts of parents. And that's a really important point, is that one reason that parent engagement is never complete or never something that can be ticked off and considered done by a school. Yep, we've got that sorted, we're done, is that, you know, each new year brings new cohorts of parents. Children's needs change as they develop. And so parent engagement with their learning needs to adapt to these changes, and schools need to be evolving all the time. And just on that point, talking about children's needs changing as they develop, this is a slide that came actually out of the Parent Engagement Conference that we hosted in 2017, 3 years ago. And this was, as the note at the bottom mentions, this slide is adapted from a presentation that was delivered by some people out of the Parenting Research Centre and the Murdoch Children's Research Centre. And we devote a little bit of time in our implementation guide to talking about how family engagement might look over time. We know, for example, that there are 3 key surges in brain development in children: the early years, the middle years around 8 to 11 years of age, and then the teenage years, the adolescent time. And for schools, this means that strategies adopted for supporting parents and families to engage in their children's learning will look different depending on the age and the development stage of the student in question. I think that's fairly obvious, but I think it's well worth noting that for the implementation guide, we really did spend quite a bit of time thinking about how this might look for different age students. And so it's well worth delving into some of the examples and some of the thinking that we've done there around what your school or what you as an educator might need to think about when thinking about how to relate to your families and engage them in their child's learning at a particular stage. Just briefly, the engagement triangle. I mean, this is just a really easy and nice way to sum up what we're talking about. We sometimes refer to family engagement in learning as a triangle. There's nothing new here. This has been around for a little while, with students, families and schools at each point. And each party needs to have a strong relationship with the other 2 parties, working together to support the child or young person's learning. And clearly we're here to talk about this external support, the parent, the family, the community, and how they're engaged in that student's learning. Schools need to be able to embed systems and structures so that parent-family engagement in learning, the engagement triangle, is strengthened. Got a bit of a definition here for you. I'll just read it so that we're all on the same page. Parent and family engagement in learning. It's about the capacity of families in partnership with schools to support learning and achievement, promoting interactions with children and young people to nurture positive attitudes towards learning, to build their confidence as learners, and the development of subjective learning for school, work and life from the time a child is born to young adulthood. And I guess the operative words here that we'd like you to think about are the capacity of families to support learning and in partnership with schools. So it's built on effective partnerships, which means that educators, families and school communities need to develop the knowledge and the skills to work together. And schools need support to purposefully integrate family engagement with the goals for students learning and thriving. I guess given where we are standing today, now more than ever in this current situation, this is why it matters, because it's really based on an understanding that while children learn in all kinds of different environments, at the centre of these interrelated systems is the dynamic between parents and families and their child or the children. And child-parent interactions that nurture positive attitudes towards learning, confidence as learners, and the development of subjective learning resources equip children to succeed. It's not about, and I can't stress this enough, it's not about families and parents being teachers themselves. That's certainly not the focus. Teachers and educators are experts in what they do, and families are experts in their children. So together, you can only imagine a very rich situation. If schools and educators haven't empowered families to play an active role in their child's learning prior to the upheaval we're experiencing now, then I think now is really that chance. Just this week, one of our favourite, I'll call her our favourite, one of our favourite international experts in the area, Dr. Debbie Pusher, and many of you will know of her work, and you may have seen her speak at our conference. She loves Australia and often comes out here to speak about family engagement. She tweeted this week that with the current picture of distance learning and teachers staying connected with students and families, they have a rich opportunity to make visible for parents all of the curriculum outcomes that they're naturally realising as they cook with their kids, as they read, as they tell stories, as they discuss the news, that sort of thing. So now is the time. Okay, I'd like to now talk to you a little bit about the embedding side of things. So let's take a look at starting the process and how schools might go about embedding this culture in their schools. A bit of a challenge here that we have, and as I mentioned before, is that parent and family engagement is a never-ending task for schools. It's an ongoing process. Each year brings a new cohort of families coming in as another leaves, taking those hard-won relationships with them. So how are schools able to future-proof their work to ensure that they aren't continually starting from scratch, so that their staff don't burn out, so that we can consistently prioritise family engagement and learning among all of the activities and responsibilities a school has to achieve? We know that schools are very, very busy places. There's a lot happening. And the research tells us to this end that for parent and family engagement to have an impact on outcomes, there's a need for a whole school approach that's embedded over the long term, and sustaining this approach is key. And so promoting, to sustain a school-wide system, it needs to have some priority. So firstly, it's worth thinking about how this is not doing more for schools. This is just about doing things differently. So when it comes to schools and educators adopting a culture of relationship-based engagement in learning, there's clearly an investment required, particularly by teachers who already have so much on their plates. I think what's worth remembering is that the research shows that engaging families can make a teacher's role easier and more fulfilling. It can seem like extra work, however, for those who've adopted, it can seem like extra work, but we know that for those who've adopted the practice successfully, it can become an integral part of their teaching practice. And it's also worth remembering that we're advocating for practices that work, not for those that are ineffective. So in our next section, we discuss the importance of schools evaluating how effective their engagement practices are, and if they're not working, to try something else. In terms of accountability and compliance regimes, school leaders and educators are compelled to embrace family engagement in both the context of school improvement and professional standards. We know that teachers and principals have the compliance at the individual level with their ATSL professional standards for teachers and for principals, and clearly there's an imperative there for educators and school leaders to regularly reflect on the standards and embed them in their practice and accountability regimes. And at the school level, each of the jurisdictions will have their frameworks for improving student outcomes or their school excellence programs and things like that. So that's something that will often have teachers working in partnership with parents, that sort of thing. Schools having a planned or proactive engagement with parents to benefit students. We also have accountability regimes at the national level. So there's the National School Improvement Tool, the NSIT. And I know some school leaders are using those in some jurisdictions, not all, but that also includes some elements of family engagement in it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Braiding with similar initiatives is something I'd like to discuss further now. Above all, we want to avoid family engagement becoming an add-on. So to turn it into business as usual, something that's embedded into the life of the school, rather than treat it as an add-on or something that's separate to core business, we want to think about braiding similar initiatives. At this point, I'll just show you, it's our 3-step diagram, I guess. This is from page 32 and 33 of our implementation guide. And this is basically the at a glance of some of the steps that we would think that schools need to consider when embedding family engagement practices. And I'd like to, it talks about leadership commitment. I'll just quickly go through it now. We talk about leadership commitment and how we need to think about getting our belief systems and getting our vision for the school in terms of its family engagement practices prepared before we even start anything else. We need to think about bringing staff on the journey. So exploring some of our assumptions about families, drafting a vision statement, that sort of thing. Building an action team is something we also see as really important, people who can carry with them the load of moving the school through these processes. We talk about kicking off how are you going to bring the team together who are going to take on some of this work, and your plan, do, assess, review, so your continuous improvement cycle. But for now, I'd just like to talk about this first step, and it includes braiding. So many of the initiatives and activities that schools and teachers are expected to conduct or incorporate into their work can have similar or complementary goals. I've got a bit of a piece here that shows how you might have a number of initiatives in a school, and through identifying and prioritising their shared and complementary goals, we can really start to bring about this whole school culture of relationship-based engagement. Explicitly identifying and prioritising these common goals ensures the best use of resources. It increases efficiency and ensures effectiveness, as well as reducing the burden of implementation on school staff. We've termed this idea as braiding. It's not our term. It's from experts from the University of Oregon, and they've shown that connecting a school-wide initiative to other initiatives and explicitly braiding them together will help ensure that the intervention is not simply an add-on, but that it's integrated as a successful component of a school-wide initiative. So The experts at the University of Oregon have identified 3 necessary stages in braiding initiatives. They talk about identifying the shared and the valued outcomes. What are our goals? They talk about defending against activities that don't help meet those goals. So if you're doing something that's not helping you meet the identified goal, why are you doing it? Sometimes you need to negotiate or push back. And it's also about finding common structures and language that can be integrated through teams, through data, through professional development. Okay, so what I want to take you through very briefly is a whole school example of braiding that might be happening commonly in Australian schools. So we've got 3 different initiatives here. We've got the National School Improvement Tool, the NSIT. We've got positive behaviour for learning. And we've got principles of pedagogy. So these all have mutually complementary goals that can be supported by the school's commitment to parent engagement in learning. So we know, for example, and I know this is very small font, the point here that I'm trying to explain is that there are several elements within the NSIT that have a particular focus on parent and family engagement, and I've highlighted those there. Same can be said for the positive behaviour for learning, and the third with principles of pedagogy. We use an example in the implementation guide which talks about, for example, to bring this sort of thing to life. If you were to imagine a school leadership team are prioritising activities that will meet more than one goal or outcome across initiatives. So for example, these 3 initiatives. An action in the school improvement plan might be, for example, to set up a Google Classroom for each year group. And the Google Classroom would provide a conduit for information about teaching and learning strategies, classroom activities each week, and extension activities to connect and apply learning at home. And it would also give parents and families an additional communication channel back into the school. So if that was to happen, that single action would support items 3 and 9 of the National School Improvement Tool. It would support 3 elements of the positive behaviour for learning. It would support item 4 of the principles of pedagogy. It would also support item, I haven't got it here on the screen, but it would support items from the ATL professional standards for teachers, and it would also include supporting the engagement of parents and carers as required by the Australian professional standards for principals. So you can start to see how braiding becomes a very important aspect of embedding parent and family engagement in learning through the school. I've just got another very quick example here. I don't want to spend too much time on this. It's a case study that we have in the implementation guide as well. And just briefly, it's an example where a Year 1 teaching group invited families to participate in teaching geography by giving a session to the 3 Year 1 classes on a country that they had a strong association with. So this is something you probably regularly see in early years in schools. So whether they'd lived there or that represented their heritage, and sessions were open-ended and flexible. So for example, one parent taught the children how to make German pretzels, and another gave a lesson in Scottish dancing. And a grandparent taught the children how to say their name and give a greeting in Colombian Spanish, and told stories of growing up in Colombia. And parents were able to observe the teachers guiding and extending the learning with questions and links back to what the children had been learning in class, giving insight into teaching methods and content. And parents could also observe the strategies that teachers used to manage the children's behaviour during an exciting and novel activity, which was bringing life to the social learning and the behaviour management framework the school used. So I think through this case study, and it goes on, we're able to show you how you can spend time thinking about how the braiding concept can lend itself to sustaining effective practices in something like parent and family engagement. Moving on, I'd like to talk now a bit about what this all means for staff and how capacity building is important given what we know about the need for professional development in this area. I've got a bit of an exercise here, but we won't do it now. It's just something to think about, which is, I mean, sometimes educators and families alike can be unaware of their own core beliefs, or it's very easy to make assumptions about the beliefs of others. And these beliefs can impact the success of family-school partnerships, as well as efforts made towards improving these practices in schools. An exercise like the circle of trust can tell us a bit about our own implicit bias. So we discover often that by thinking about a list of sort of 6 to 10 people who you trust that aren't family members, we often find that our inner circle includes people with very similar backgrounds to our own. And we think this is very important because educators spending time sort of checking and evaluating their core values and the assumptions they might make about their families is a really valuable exercise, particularly as an intentional practice. And through team discussions, we can become aware of our own and others' experiences, their hopes, their fears, their concerns, and this can start to break down some barriers. I think the key challenge here is that we know that educators aren't often specifically trained in forming relationships with their students' families for the benefit of learning outcomes. So in any teaching team, we'll find a spectrum of skills and comfort with this and varying degrees of value placed on these skills by individual staff. Unfortunately, sometimes it's seen as softer work rather than a skill that staff need to build capacity in. There was a recent report that came from the Frameworks Institute in the States, which shows that there tends to be a reduction of engagement into highly personalised terms, something that just sort of comes down to relationships between individuals. So some people are good at it and others aren't, and it can just be because it's sort of about two individuals or whatever. We think this is really important because that's far too narrow a focus, because it really does exclude that this work is a formal part of the staff role and that staff need opportunities to learn and to practice and to build capacity. Family engagement is about relationships, and so for it to happen successfully, schools need to embed appropriate structures and provide the resources and supports required by their staff to sustain engagement practice. And that makes sure that it doesn't just become, an add-on or separate to core business. It means that all staff need to be on board and hold a shared vision and understanding of what it is. Again, I come back to our 3-step diagram, and here I'm just going to talk about this idea of bringing staff on the journey and the need for professional development in this area. I've got a quote here from Janet Goodall, who I mentioned before, who works out of the UK in Wales at the moment. She used to be at the University of Bath, but not anymore. She talks about how you wouldn't expect staff to teach a new curriculum without support and training. So therefore, why would we expect staff who are highly trained, competent professionals in one area to be competent in another without further knowledge and training? And that working with parents or other adults requires knowledge and skills that teachers need to acquire, just as they did the knowledge and skills for working with young people. So we've had a little bit of a think about this. We know that the majority of school leaders believe that engaging parents and families is the responsibility of all staff. We also know that educators receive little or no explicit training about how to engage parents. And we also know from a recent study out of the UK that only about 10% of schools have a plan for how they would like their staff to work with parents and families. And also we know from some work that we did with the Australian Council for Deans of Education that there is very minimal coursework provided for initial teacher education students in parent engagement. This is changing as coursework needs to be delivered now. It's a requirement, but things are going to take time. So there's almost this assumption that teachers, quote, just know, unquote, how to engage families effectively. And we're also mindful that there can be really good work happening that isn't recognised as parent and family engagement because of misunderstandings about what it really is, for example, involvement versus engagement. So we've been looking a little bit about the spectrum of how the spectrum of value of parent engagement and how the comfort of engaging with families might look amongst a school team or a staff team. So we've got this high comfort, low comfort idea, and perceived value being low or high as well. And I just like to, we've sort of thought about what it would mean. So on staff, you might have someone who's in that top right corner, who's informed and knowledgeable, very comfortable. They appreciate the value of it, and they can see that it's really important. They feel supported by school leadership in their role. They would actually make it quite a good action team member, and that's something that we talk about in the guide itself. We've got these on the top left, so they've got a really high comfort, but the issue is that they don't see it as a very valuable. It's not a valuable issue for them. It's quite low value. So they easily form good relationships, but they may not appreciate that link between student outcomes and family engagement. And they might not fully value or even recognise the effort and worth of their own engagement actions. And the school is very vulnerable to losing good practice when this sort of person or this educator moves on. Equally at risk are those who they see the value, but they're really not confident or comfortable with engaging with families. And this is often what you see in quite young or new teachers. They need additional support, they need the mentoring, but they can easily be moved up to that top right corner. And then of course we've got those who have low comfort and really don't see that there's any value in it. And they think it's a low priority. It's a nice to have, but it doesn't matter that much. And just quickly, I'd just like to just briefly discuss where our threats, where our opportunities are. Clearly, this person here is a really valuable member of staff. The two that are in these sort of opposite dimensions are at risk. They're at risk because if our top left leaves the school, that's a really good resource that's gone. But equally, if our staff member who's not confident but sees the value but just needs some extra development or mentoring isn't able to receive that, then that's a problem as well for the school. And clearly there's a really big threat for staff who just don't see the value in it. So within schools and clusters, we need to work with staff on reflective practices and overcoming their assumptions. We need to share the load. We need to make sure that family engagement doesn't constantly land with any one person, particularly that person up in the top right corner. It doesn't just become their job because they're seen as being good at it. Okay, I'm getting close to finishing now. Just quickly like to talk about the continuous improvement cycles and the sustainability of efforts, and that's really this last section of our diagram here, the three-step diagram. We know that planning can make the difference in whether family engagement activities engage most of the families in the school community and support student learning, or that they only really reach a few families and they have limited impact on learning. What we need to think about is how we're getting that monitoring and evaluation right. So we spend quite a bit of time in the implementation guide talking about the plan, do, assess, review cycle. It's really important to make sure that we are able to plan and identify the desired impact of any family engagement strategies and how we're going to measure that impact. And we've got some ideas about that in the implementation guide. We want to implement engagement-focused activities, strategies or programs, and collect information on outcome indicators. So that's your doing. With the assessing, we need to assess the information collected. We want to make sense of any data, and we want to be able to draw conclusions about the outcomes. And of course, as part of the reviewing, we need to be able to communicate the impact. So that's about celebrating and widely sharing success, and even celebrating failure, because that's obviously not as crazy as it sounds. We know we tell our students, our children about growth mindset and learning from our failures, and it's obviously not as crazy as it sounds. And we need to recalibrate on what's working less well. There might be some things that just have strong impacts and others that don't. So it's time to think about really understanding whether it's a good idea to let those go and work on the things that might be working better. As we wrap up, I'd like to reflect on the fact that schools are very different places today than they were a few weeks ago, and learning, whether you're calling it remote learning, I've seen a few terms bandied about, whether we're calling it remote learning or distance learning or home learning, it's now our key form of education, perhaps for some time to come. And it's obviously a really interesting point in time in which we can highlight the idea of family engagement being an optional extra or a nice to have, because it really shifts it now to a have to have. And at the moment, as always, the concern is for our most vulnerable families, those without online options, those who have children with special needs. We know that times of stress can bring issues to the fore. So if partnerships between families and their schools aren't well established, this is a time for schools to really be reaching out specifically to those families and to start building those relationships and restoring trust. Otherwise, we can't have that desired effect on learning during this difficult time. Just briefly, we've got a lot of resources listed in the implementation guide. A couple I thought were worth mentioning here. I would really recommend visiting the Parent Engagement Conference website, which is still open and has all of the content from the conference itself. It's worth listening to some of the keynote speakers and some of the other presenters. In particular, I would like to recommend the presentation from Dr. Tim Moore from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, MCRI. And he delivered a really good presentation. It's been talked about and discussed by other international keynote speakers who were there at the time and also listened to this. And the reason it's really important is because it talks about the neurobiology behind the engagement relationship. So what are the factors that need to be in place before a relationship can focus on the engagement? And of course, all of our resources from the Parent Engagement Project are listed on pages 104 to 105 and even more. I think there's all the surveys and things like that we've got available. So without any further ado, I will now say thank you. Thank you very much for listening. And I'd like to offer the space now for you to ask any questions you might like. Yep, thank you for that, Dale. We've got the question pane there, so please ask us any questions you might like while we've got some time. And if nothing comes up, that's okay. Please don't hesitate to email us if you might have any questions you'd like to ask us after the session has finished. That is fine as well.
Thank you so much, Barbara. We do have some questions coming in. And before we get started with those, I just wanted to mention another resource as well. We will be publishing a recording of this webinar on our website, and we'll make that link available in our Friday e-bulletin. So along with this webinar, I'll also include a copy of Barbara's presentation slides as a PDF, the links that Barbara included at the end of her presentation, and a couple of other webinars as well. So, Barbara, you mentioned Dr. Tim Moore's YouTube link. Is that on the neuroscience of relationships?
Yep.
And I also thought of something which would complement another one of your slides, and that was another webinar on parent engagement we had from Sue Brown of the SMAG cluster in Melbourne, cluster of schools, who helped overcome barriers amongst teaching staff to adopting parent engagement practices, bringing staff on the journey as you described it. And webinar is called Building Teacher Confidence Through Action Research. So her team have conducted research into barriers to parent engagement and then figured out how to bring those barriers down. So if you want to carry on with questions, Barbara, I'll shut up for a mo.
Okay. Okay, well, it doesn't look like, I can't see any questions there unless you can, Dale.
Sorry, you might need to stop yourself. You've gone very quiet.
I can't see any questions that have come through. Are you able to see any?
Yeah, I can, and I can read some of those out. We've had a few from Tanya. One was, where does well-being fit in the official looking description of parent engagement that we had fairly early on in the presentation? I know as an Aracy colleague that everything we do is framed around child well-being, specifically around the NEST, a very well-researched well-being model, which is also an action plan. So I know how parent engagement and learning fits in with well-being, but where does well-being fit in with the description of parent engagement?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's obviously really important. And I don't know whether the question is asking about the well-being of educators or the well-being of students or the well-being of families. But I think it's fundamental. Yep. And so without our well-being, learning is really, it's intrinsic to the well-being and the learning of a young person.
And the NEST shows that, and as you introduced it earlier, learning is part of our well-being, but all of those domains support each other. So they are interactive.
Absolutely.
So if you can't see the questions, I'll read a couple out if that's okay.
Great. I'm sorry I can't see them. I can see
no worries.
Yeah.
We have a question from Veronica that says Google Classrooms or similar is great, but not if it's solely presented in school language. How do we build the capacity of staff to feel safe to use family-friendly language in all communication with families, reducing jargon and alienating terms such as learning intentions?
That's a really good point. We do come across this issue of jargon a lot. Jargon
Sorry,
is problematic.
The audio is cutting in and out. Would you mind starting what you just said again, please?
Okay. Can you hear me now? I think that jargon's a really interesting point, and I think that's where we need to work very closely with parents to make sure that everything is understandable from different diverse communities, and also just parents generally. We talk about in our implementation guide the use of an action team. And I mean, that's just one way of making sure that the school community is represented thoroughly. And this is an opportunity, I think, for educators and families to come together for better understanding, to make sure that communication is as clear as possible.
Barb, I have another question to read out, and I suspect communicating with parents is at the heart of this one as well, and how we communicate with parents. Jeff asks, the Braiding example of a whole school culture of parent and family engagement contained an action of defending against activities that don't meet the goals. How can schools defend against activities of parents and families that don't nurture positive attitudes towards learning due to a lack of parent confidence, abilities, or interest? How do we overcome parent and family resistance to engagement?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think we often hear about families that don't seem to be engaged. I think that's what the question is asking, and that they might have a different view of education or a different style of valuing education than the school might have with their initiatives. I think that comes down to really understanding both parties really well. And I would start by making sure that the relationship is pretty firm from the start of the school year. So making as many opportunities as possible for parents and families to get on the same page. It isn't easy. And, you know, countless studies have shown that there are a whole range of ways that families will see that they want to engage in their family's learning. And we know that for them to be able to engage, they need to feel like they have a purpose and have, you know, a confidence and can have an impact on their child's learning. And I think we need to be able to send those messages to parents that they're doing a really good job, that they're not needing to do something that's rocket science, that they know their child best. And so we need to support some of the things that they're doing and perhaps build on that if necessary, or not. But to make sure that families and educators are on the same page, I do think it's important to make sure that those opportunities happen very early in the school year. And I think particularly seeing what situation we're in right now, I think schools that have done probably better than others are those that have made sure they've had those chances early in the school year and were fortunate enough to get some of those relationships off the ground early before we suddenly found ourselves in the situation we're in now, which makes it a little bit trickier to forge good relationships.
And Barbara, if you don't mind me adding to that as well, based on another question from someone else who says, Brenda says, there is a step before engagement and this is building trust. This is something that we've both mentioned, Dr. Tim Moore from MCRI, talking about the science of relationships and how they are a vehicle to successful parent engagement. That forms part of that. That endorses what you've said, Brenda. And also when it comes to you know, getting parents on board or others, then I think I said maybe communications is something we can look at. You've mentioned, Barbara, the Frameworks Institute and their work, excuse me, and their work on communicating. The Parenting Research Centre have released a report based on Frameworks research that discusses the language we can use when talking with parents and with organisations that work with parents to help properly frame the work we can do together for better outcomes without discriminating and without raising anyone's hackles. And it's research-based, a research-based project. So there's evidence behind these choices of words and ways of framing things that can help. And before we go to any other questions, I should say that we're out of time. So I'd like to thank you so much for your presentation and for dealing with the questions we've had. There are more questions. It's looking really interesting. So Barb, if you don't mind, I'll be sharing those questions with you, and we can post those with lots of other resources on our website with the webinar recording. So hopefully the webinar recording will be available by the end of this week, and I hope that we can include a link to it in our Friday e-bulletin. If you don't already receive our Friday newsletter, we try to make it as informative as possible for everyone working with young people, everyone who cares about their well-being. And you can sign up for that at aracy.org.au/register. And although the world is upside down at the moment, we do have more professional and useful webinars lined up in the coming months. And although I don't think they're posted online yet, please do keep an eye on aracy.org.au/events, where we'll post information about those very soon. Thank you once again, Barbara, for your presentation. I hope everyone will download the Parent Engagement Implementation Guide and visit the page it's on with all of the resources that Barbara's talked about. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Thanks very much. We'll see you again soon.